My brother took everything our parents left me, so I took back more than he expected. The morning my brother locked the gate to our family farm for good, even the wind stood still, as if the land itself was holding its breath. The old oak trees lining the driveway didn't sway, the grass didn't rustle. There was a silence to that morning that didn't feel empty, but final. I sat down the road in my aging truck, engine off, listening to the quiet while watching him walk the perimeter like he owned the place. Clipboard in hand, sunglasses on, that same arrogant tilt of his chin I'd seen the day we lowered our parents into the ground. It was like watching a stranger walk through the bones of my childhood, dismantling it piece by piece with a pen instead of a hammer. I gripped the steering wheel so tight my hands went numb. I could still picture Mama's roses growing wild near the porch, now strangled by weeds. The rusted swing where Dad used to push us when the sun dipped below the trees. The kitchen window that always glowed warm with supper waiting. To him, it was all just real estate, lines on a deed, numbers in a ledger. But to me, that land held something far more sacred. It held history. It held breath. It held my parents' laughter, the sweat of our summers, the silence of our grief. That farm didn't just raise corn and cattle, it raised us. I wasn't always this quiet. In my youth I spoke fast, fought hard, and believed things would always sort themselves out if you just stayed kind. But time has a way of chipping at a man, of teaching you that stillness isn't always weakness, sometimes it's strategy. When our parents passed, my brother offered to handle the estate. He said it would be simpler that way. I agreed. I trusted him. Maybe I was naive. Maybe I just didn't want to believe that the boy I once shared a bedroom with could become the man who'd cut me out without blinking. Weeks later, I showed up to find the house locked, the will rewritten, the land stripped from beneath my feet, like it had never been mine to begin with. No warning, no explanation, just cold, clinical betrayal dressed in a tailored suit. I told myself I'd walk away, that fighting over dirt wasn't worth losing what little family I had left. I packed up what was mine, a few boxes, a few memories, and disappeared into a smaller, quieter life. I found work in a sleepy town repairing broken things, chairs, clocks, other people's heirlooms. There's peace in that kind of work. And for a while I convinced myself that peace was enough. People said I had a calm about me, a gentle patience. What they didn't see was the fire I kept buried, like an ember under ash. Small, but waiting. But then he crossed the line. The land was no longer enough. My brother wanted to bulldoze it all, sell it to developers, and turn our family's legacy into luxury weekend rentals. And worst of all, he planned to evict Mr. Carlos, the old caretaker who had been with our family longer than I'd been alive. The same man who taught me how to tie my first knot, who bandaged my knees when I fell, who sat with my mother while she died. My brother sent him a letter, cold and official, telling him to get out. No conversation, no gratitude, just a deadline. That was the moment something shifted in me, not rage, but resolve. That kind of disrespect doesn't get to walk away untouched. My story isn't about revenge in the way people imagine it, with shouting and fists and courtrooms. It's about memory, it's about loyalty, it's about the quiet kind of justice a man pursues when everything else has been taken from him but his name. I never planned to go back, but some roots grow so deep they don't let go. And when a man's pushed to the edge of what he can bear, sometimes the only thing left to do is reclaim what's right. Not with noise, but with purpose. What followed wasn't loud, but it echoed. Through the town, through my brother's carefully crafted world, through every acre of the land that once called me home. And in the end, I didn't just take back what was stolen. I reminded them all that some things, dignity, love, family, can't be signed away. They live in the soil, in the stories, in the hands of the people who never stopped believing. The years after I left the farm moved slowly, like syrup sliding down the side of a jar. I settled in a town that barely had a name, the kind of place where folks nodded instead of talking. I rented a one-room cottage behind a carpenter's shop and traded my tools for the ones left behind by an old man who'd passed the trade down through dusty drawers and worn-out benches. Fixing broken chairs and restoring cracked tables wasn't glamorous, but it kept my hands busy and my mind quieter. I learned the rhythm of wood, how it creaked when it missed home, how it split when it held too much grief. Funny how objects can speak louder than people when you learn to listen. Now and then, I'd hear from someone back home, mostly whispers through mutual friends or short letters that smelled of old envelopes and fading ties. I never answered them. My brother never wrote. He didn't need to. The silence between us said more than any letter ever could, but I kept tabs in my way. I knew the farm was still running, that he'd brought in new workers and machines, turning the soil we once tended by hand into a business line item. I told myself I didn't care. I told myself I had peace. But some nights, when the wind howled just right, I'd dream of our mother's laugh echoing through the kitchen window, and I'd wake up with clenched fists and a hollow in my chest. People in town started calling me Mr. Eli, short for Elijah, though few knew much beyond that. I was just the quiet old man who fixed things that shouldn't have been thrown out. Maybe that's why the local kids liked me. They brought me broken toys and splintered skateboards, and I'd fix them without charge. I suppose part of me saw myself in those things, discarded, cracked, forgotten. But not useless, never useless. It's strange how kindness becomes armor. How small acts of repair can slowly stitch your soul back together without you even realizing. One afternoon, I got a visit that changed everything. My old friend Thomas, the town's only notary, and someone I hadn't seen in over a decade, knocked on my workshop door with his worn leather briefcase and a look that said the past wasn't done with me. "Thought you might want to see this," he said, handing me a copy of a land transfer notice. My brother's name was on it. So was the name of a real estate developer. The paper said, "Final phase of sale." But what twisted my gut was the small note at the bottom. All tenants to vacate by the end of the month. That included Mr. Carlos. That included the last thread connecting the farm to the people who made it a home. I remember standing there, the paper trembling in my hand, not from age, but from something deeper, a rage I hadn't felt in years. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't cry. But something ancient and powerful cracked open inside me. It wasn't just about the land. It wasn't just about betrayal. It was about memory, about the dignity of the people who raised me, about a promise buried in the soil. I looked up at Thomas and said the words before I even realized they'd left my mouth. "He doesn't get to bury them again." That's when I knew I was going back, not as a victim, not as a brother begging for scraps, but as a man who'd come to reclaim something far more sacred than property. The road back to the farm hadn't changed much. The same sharp turns, the same rusted signs, the same stretch of dirt road that kicked up dust like ghosts rising from the past. I drove slowly, window down, letting the wind carry the scent of pine and memory. Every bend in the road brought a new wave of recollection. My mother humming while hanging clothes, my father whistling as he sharpened his scythe, and the three of us boys running barefoot between the apple trees. But this time, I wasn't just a passenger of nostalgia. I was a witness returning to the scene of a crime, long buried under politeness and silence. When the farmhouse came into view, it felt like staring at a stranger wearing my father's clothes. The shutters were new, too clean. The barn had a fresh coat of paint that masked the years of sweat soaked into its beams. And the porch, the same porch where my mother used to serve lemonade, now had patio furniture that looked like it belonged in some glossy city catalogue. My brother had polished it all into something marketable, erasing the imperfections that made it real. I parked under the old oak tree where our dog used to dig for bones and sat for a moment, heart pounding. I wasn't sure if it was fear or fury, maybe both. I knocked on the front door like a guest. No key in my hand, no right to enter uninvited. He answered after a pause, wearing a press shirt and the same smug look he had the day of the will. "Well," he said, stepping aside just far enough. "Look who decided to come home." There was no warmth in his voice, just that familiar condescension, sharpened over years of getting exactly what he wanted. I stepped inside, scanning the living room. It was neat, lifeless, sterile. No family photos, no hint of the past, as if he'd bleached our childhood from the walls. "I heard about the sale," I said flatly. "Carlos and the others, they deserve better." He shrugged. "It's just business." I didn't raise my voice. That would have pleased him. I just looked around, then let my eyes land on the old clock above the mantel, still ticking, still counting time long after the moments had passed. "You're not just selling wood and dirt," I told him. "You're selling graves. You're selling stories." He laughed, low and bitter. "You always were sentimental, that's why you lost." That word, lost, struck deeper than I expected, but I didn't flinch. "I didn't lose," I said, turning toward the door. "I walked away, but now I'm back, and I won't let you erase what they built." I drove into town that afternoon, the weight of our conversations settling in my bones like early frost. I needed allies, people who remembered the farm before the profit margins, people who knew my parents not as landowners, but as neighbors. I stopped at the feed store first, then the church, then the diner where we used to get peach pie after Sunday service. Faces lit up when they saw me, some with surprise, others with quiet recognition. I didn't ask for anything yet, I just listened, asked questions, let them talk, let them remember. Because if I was going to fight my brother, I wouldn't do it with fists or lawyers. I'd do it with memory, the kind that outlives any signature on a deed. The following morning I woke before the sun, as I used to when I was a boy helping my father. The scent of wet earth drifted through the window of the motel room. Spring rain had passed in the night, soaking the land and softening the roads. I pulled on my boots and stepped out into the chill. Something about that early hour, when the world is still catching its breath, gave me clarity. Today, I would visit Carlos. He had worked that farm longer than I had been alive, a second father in many ways, though I had never told him that. If anyone knew the soul of that land, it was him. And if anyone still had a claim to its memory, it was both of us. Carlos lived in a modest house near the edge of town, surrounded by old tires, rusting tools, and a garden bursting with stubborn vegetables. He was on the porch, sitting in a rocking chair that creaked like it knew secrets. When he saw me, he didn't smile, just stared for a long moment, as if measuring whether I was real or another ghost of the past. "You got taller," he said finally, voice dry like gravel. I smiled. "You got slower." That earned me a grunt, and then he motioned for me to sit. We talked for hours, the way only old men can, and slowly, looping around stories like vines. He told me how my brother had slowly edged him out, cutting his pay, moving his tools, making it clear he wasn't welcome. I listened, jaw tight, heart burning. I thought I'd been the only one betrayed, but hearing Carlos, I realized my brother hadn't just stolen from me. He'd stolen from everyone who'd made that land what it was. "He changed the soil," Carlos said, staring into the distance. "Put chemicals in it, said it'd make things grow faster. But some things, boy, they take time, love, memory. You can't rush that." He looked at me then, eyes sharp despite the years. "So what are you gonna do?" I didn't answer right away. Instead, I asked him something I hadn't dared ask before. Did my parents know what he planned? Carlos looked away, and that silence told me everything. With Carlos's blessing, I walked the old fence line of the farm that afternoon. The posts were still there, crooked and leaning, wrapped in vines. I ran my fingers over the worn wood, remembering the days we'd mended together, me, Dad, and my brother, back when sweat was shared and not sold. As I neared the southern edge, near the woods, I stumbled upon something unexpected. The old tool shed, half buried in moss, its door ajar. Inside, it was as if time had been sealed in dust. My father's hat still hung on a nail, my initials carved into a bench, and in a weathered envelope on the highest shelf, a copy of a will. older than the one read at the funeral. I froze. My breath caught in my throat as I opened it. The ink was faded, but the names were clear. Mine and my brother's, equal heirs. The signature, my father's, dated 6 months before the accident. My hands shook. Either this had been forgotten or hidden, and if hidden, by whom and why? The implications settled slowly, like falling snow. My brother hadn't just taken more. He had erased my share from the beginning. A forgery, a manipulation, I didn't know yet. But now I had something solid, not just anger, not just memory. I had proof. And with that, the game changed. I drove straight to the county records office, the document held tight in my jacket. The clerk, a woman in her 60s with glasses on a chain, recognized my last name and raised an eyebrow. I didn't explain much, just requested a copy of the will on file and the notary records. She tapped away, printed some forms, then paused. "This doesn't match," she murmured, comparing the signatures. My chest tightened. She looked up at me, wary now. "You might want to talk to the county registrar." And just like that, the path I thought was sealed shut began to crack open. My brother had rewritten our family's story, but I had just found the original script. The registrar's office was tucked behind a row of metal filing cabinets and smelled faintly of old coffee and carbon paper. A man named Douglas greeted me, balding, suspicious, the type who had seen enough small-town drama to know when not to ask questions. I handed him both documents, the registered will, the one used at my parents' funeral, and the one I had found hidden in the shed. He examined them without a word for several minutes, the ticking of the wall clock our only soundtrack. Then he stood, disappeared into a back room, and returned with a magnifying glass and a stack of signature logs. "This might take time," he warned, but I didn't leave. I waited, silent, stomach coiled tight. After nearly an hour, he looked up. "The one you brought," he said, tapping the original I'd found, "is the real one." He pointed to small notations in the ink, the paper's age, even the unique pressure points in my father's signature. The one on file, the ink's newer, slightly different pressure, close but not quite. He leaned back, eyes narrowing. "This second one, the official one, was filed after your father died." That hit me like a slap. I stared at him. "You mean someone forged it?" He didn't answer, but the weight of his silence said enough. My father had intended to leave us equal shares. My brother had rewritten that wish. It wasn't a misunderstanding, it was betrayal, pure and deliberate. I stepped outside into the gray afternoon light, the sky low and threatening rain. My boots felt heavier than ever as I walked back to the truck. Everything looked different now. The roads, the fields, even the trees. It was as if I had slipped into a shadow version of my own past, where nothing was as I remembered. And yet, strangely, I felt calm. Not angry, not even sad, just resolved. For years I had carried the pain of being pushed aside, convinced myself that silence was dignity. But now I knew the truth, and the truth had weight. It could be used. It could speak. I drove straight to the edge of the old property. Carlos was still there, tending to a broken fence post. I told him everything, about the shed, the will, the forgery. His jaw clenched. "I knew that bastard was slick," he muttered. "Didn't think he'd go that far." He took off his hat, rubbed his face, then looked me square in the eye. "So what now?" That question echoed through me like a bell. What now? I could file a legal challenge, take it to court, drag it all into the open. But lawsuits were slow, expensive, public, and my brother was slippery. He'd lawyered up long ago. I didn't want a courtroom. I wanted something deeper. I wanted the town, the people who watched all this unfold, to see the truth. Carlos and I sat beneath the oak tree behind the barn, planning in quiet voices as the wind moved through the tall grass. We would need more than just documents. We'd need testimony, memory, presence. The people who had worked on the farm, the ones my brother pushed out, the neighbors who remembered my parents' values, we'd bring them back. Not for a trial, but for a reckoning. I wanted to hold an open gathering on the farm itself, a memorial of sorts. Not for the dead, for the forgotten. a reclamation. Let the community see what had been stolen and from whom. Let my brother feel what it meant to be seen for what he truly was. And maybe, just maybe, I'd finally feel like I had come home. The morning we chose for the gathering was warm for that time of year, with a gentle breeze that carried the scent of hay and dust. I woke before the sun rose and stood at the edge of the old property, where the gravel drive curved gently toward the barn. It had been decades since it had felt like home, but that morning it breathed with a kind of quiet promise. I'd called in every favor I had. Old friends, former farmhands, neighbors, even some folks from church who remembered my parents' open table and generous hands. All of them had agreed to come. No speeches, I told them. Just presence, just truth. Carlos arrived first, in a clean shirt and boots polished to a shine. Behind him came Mrs. Lillian from the dairy road, who brought fresh cornbread in a dish wrapped with linen. Then came the twins, Ben and Rufus, who used to work the fields in the summer and now ran their own trucking company. Each person brought something, a memory, a photo, a story. Some came just to sit beneath the giant oak trees where my father used to hold barbecues on Sunday afternoons. I laid out the original will on a wooden table near the barn doors, held down by two smooth river stones. It wasn't a courtroom, but it was sacred just the same. By mid-morning, there were more than 50 people gathered. Some stood silently, others exchanged quiet greetings, their eyes darting toward the farmhouse at the far end of the field, my brother's stronghold. I didn't expect him to come, but part of me hoped he would. I stood with Carlos, watching as one by one people came to the table and read the old will. A few wept. Others shook their heads in disbelief. My father had been a man of principle, and this document made it plain that he wanted fairness, not division. This changes things, someone whispered, and I nodded, because it did. It changed everything. Later I spoke, not from a podium, but simply standing on the porch steps. I told them what had happened, not in anger, but with clarity. How I had chosen silence, thinking it was peace. How that silence had cost us all something. I thanked them for coming. This farm, I said, was built with more than sweat. It was built with trust. My father believed in giving everyone a fair place at the table. That's the legacy we're honoring today. There was no applause, just quiet affirmation. Nods, tears, arms folded across chests. It was more powerful than any gavel could ever strike. As the sun began to lower behind the fields, a single truck rumbled down the gravel path. My brother. He stepped out in a crisp shirt, eyes hidden behind sunglasses, jaw tight as steel. He looked at the crowd, at the table with the will, at me. For a moment, I thought he might turn back, but instead, he walked forward. People moved aside without a word. He stood before the will, reading it, lips pressed thin. Then he turned to me, voice low and strained. "So this is how you want to play it?" I didn't answer with words. I just stepped aside, letting the truth between us speak louder than anything I could say. The silence that followed my brother's words was heavier than any shouting match could have been. People didn't move, didn't speak. It was like the whole gathering held its breath. I looked him in the eye and saw it, not just anger, but fear. He knew the will was real. He knew I had the people behind me, and worse, he knew the community was watching. For the first time in years, the weight of his decisions was no longer hidden behind closed doors or polite silence. The shadows where he'd done his dealings were now flooded with daylight. He stood there stiff for a few moments, and then walked away from the table. I thought he might leave, but instead he walked straight into the old farmhouse. I followed after a minute or two, more out of instinct than plan. Inside, everything was the same as I remembered. The faded wallpaper, the crooked pictures on the wall, the dusty lamp our mother used to read under. He was pacing in the kitchen, the same kitchen where our father taught us how to clean fish, and our mother baked bread on cold mornings. "You think this changes anything?" he asked, voice low but shaking. I didn't answer right away, because yes, it changed everything. but not in the way he feared. I told him I wasn't there to fight over furniture or fences. This place wasn't about the land, I said. It was about what it meant to us, to them, to this town. And you've forgotten that. He scoffed, called me sentimental, said I'd always been the soft one. But I saw his eyes as he sat at the table, the same table our parents had once gathered us around. And in that moment, it was like he saw ghosts. Not the haunting kind, but the kind that remind you who you used to be before greed got a hold of your heart. There was pain in his silence, the kind that runs too deep to speak aloud. We sat in that house until the sun dipped low. We didn't come to an agreement. He didn't apologize, but something shifted. He stopped arguing, stopped pretending he had the high ground. I told him the old will was now in the community's hands, filed, backed by testimonies, ready to stand if he tried to fight it legally. You can keep pretending you're winning, I said, or you can help rebuild what you broke. For the first time in decades, I saw doubt in his posture. A man no longer sure if he was right, or even if he remembered why he wanted all of it in the first place. That evening, I walked out of the farmhouse and back to the oak trees where the last of the neighbors were still gathered. The fire pit was glowing, and someone had started passing around sweet tea. They asked if everything was settled. I shook my head, but smiled. Not settled, I said, but something's begun. And truly it had. Not revenge. Something deeper. A reckoning, yes, but also a chance to build again, this time on memory and truth, not bitterness. The fire that had been sleeping in me, the fire of my family's legacy, had been awakened, and I wasn't going to let it die again. The next few days moved like molasses, thick with conversations, with quiet tension, with things unsaid that hung in the air like smoke from a long dead fire. I didn't see my brother again for a while, but I heard whispers that he'd stopped the sale, that he'd asked the lawyer to pause the paperwork, that he'd been seen walking the edge of the field we used to run through as kids, staring out like a man trying to remember something he'd buried. I didn't celebrate, not yet. I knew how pride worked. It could lie low, pretend to retreat, and strike again when you least expected. But something had shifted. I could feel it in the land itself, as if the earth had been holding its breath and was now slowly exhaling. One morning I returned to the farmhouse, not to confront, but to clean. The place hadn't seen a proper broom in years. Dust clung to every surface like regret, and the windows were so clouded they barely let in the light. I opened the back door, let the breeze sweep through, and started with the old kitchen. Each drawer was a memory. Measuring spoons rusted at the edges, a cracked teacup from when I was 7, the faded note my mother had left once reminding us to be kind or be quiet. I didn't know why I was doing it. Maybe it was grief. Maybe it was healing. Maybe it was just the only thing I could control. And then something unexpected happened. A knock, slow, unsure. I turned, expecting maybe a neighbor, but it was him, my brother. He stood on the porch, holding something in his hands. It was the family photo album, the one he'd claimed years ago, saying it belonged with the house. He didn't say a word, just walked in and placed it on the counter. He didn't open it, didn't sit down. But he looked around the kitchen with eyes softer than I remembered. I forgot how small this room was, he muttered. I nodded, wiping my hands on a rag. It always felt bigger when we were happy, I said, and for a flicker of a moment, we were both boys again, side by side, before the inheritance, before the bitterness. We didn't have a long talk. There were no grand gestures or sudden embraces, just two old men sharing the same air, the same ghosts. He mentioned the workers, said he wasn't going to evict them after all. They've taken better care of this land than I ever did, he admitted. I told him about Martin, the farmhand who'd stayed loyal even when the fields went dry. He taught me how to prune the orchard, I said. Told me the trees needed patience, not just water. My brother looked down, nodded once, and left. That was it, but it was enough. That night, I lit the old fire pit behind the house. Alone, for the first time in a long while. I sat with the photo album on my lap, flipping through pages I hadn't seen in decades. My parents' faces stared back at me, strong, weathered, full of quiet love. I whispered apologies to them for not fighting sooner, for walking away when I should have stayed, for letting the house fall into silence. But then I remembered what they always told us. Home isn't the house, it's the stories we keep alive. And there, under the stars, with smoke rising like a prayer, I knew I was keeping them alive. The roots had been shaken, but the tree still stood. The next morning, I rose with the sun, not because I had to, but because the old rhythm of the land had taken hold of me again. My boots found their way to the orchard almost without thinking. The trees were still, dew resting on every leaf like blessings from the night. I ran my hand along the bark of the oldest apple tree, the one my father planted when my brother was born. Its branches twisted like time itself, heavy with the weight of many seasons. There was peace here, a kind of hush that doesn't ask questions or offer explanations. Just being there felt like a quiet ceremony, a communion between blood, memory, and soil. Later that day, Martin came by, his cap in his hands and eyes wide with disbelief. "I heard he called it off," he said, voice cracking just slightly. "Said the sail's off, said we can stay." I nodded, holding back the emotions swelling in my chest. "He did," I replied. Martin smiled in that way only people who've worked land their whole lives do. Like hope and skepticism had learned to live side by side in his soul. "Guess miracles still happen, huh?" he said, before walking to the barn like he'd never left. Watching him disappear into the morning fog, I realized something. Some roots never die, they just wait for the right season to bloom again. I spent the rest of the day going through old boxes in the attic. Dust motes danced in the sunbeams like fireflies, and the smell of cedar and thyme filled my lungs. I found letters from my mother to my father, written during their brief courtship. Found my brother's report cards, yellowed and dog-eared. Found my own, always tucked behind his, always second. And then I found something else, a small box wrapped in faded cloth. Inside was my father's pocket knife, the one I thought had been lost. I remembered the day he gave it to me, said, "This is for when you need to do something hard and honest." I held it in my hand and realized that time had come, and maybe it had already passed. That night I sat by the fire again, this time with Martin and two of the older workers who'd stayed on the land. We shared stories, sipped black coffee, and let the silence between tales stretch long and wide. One of them, Eli, said something that stayed with me. This place never stopped being home, it just waited for someone to come back to it. The wind moved through the trees like breath, and the embers crackled with every shift. For the first time, I didn't feel like a visitor in my own skin. The land had accepted me again, and maybe, just maybe, I had accepted myself too. Days passed, and I kept to my quiet work, fixing the fence, sanding the porch railing, feeding the chickens that still wandered the back coop like gossiping old ladies. People from the town started stopping by, some just to say hello, others with tools in hand, ready to help. A few apologized for not reaching out sooner, for taking sides they didn't fully understand. I didn't hold it against them. Time has a way of clarifying who we are and what we stand for. And as more people gathered, brought life back to this place, I realized that what I'd reclaimed wasn't just a house or a patch of land. It was a legacy, not of ownership, but of care, of stewardship, of honoring those who came before by tending to what they left behind. And still, my brother remained at a distance. We hadn't spoken again, not beyond that exchange in the kitchen, but I saw signs, a toolbox left on the porch, firewood stacked beside the door, an old photo of our parents pinned to the barn wall. He was there, in the corners, in the shadows, in the small gestures that didn't need a name. I knew better than to push. Some men say more in silence than others do with speeches, and for now, his silence didn't feel like absence. It felt like peace offering. It was near dusk when I wandered out to the west field, the one we used to call the Quiet Acre. My father had always said there was something different about that stretch of land. Softer earth, gentler winds, as if even nature knew it was meant for gentler things. I hadn't walked that path in decades, but my feet remembered the way. Wild grass brushed against my boots, and dragonflies flickered in the air like tiny lanterns. I paused by the old fence post where I had carved my initials as a boy. The letters were still there, faded but stubborn, just like me. And for a moment, I stood still and listened, not just to the wind, but to the echo of every promise that had ever been made here. I began to plant again, not for profit but for memory. Tomatoes, just like Mom used to grow by the kitchen window. Peas, which my brother and I once shelled together every summer afternoon. I dug with my hands, feeling the cool dampness of the soil, as if the land was welcoming me back into the rhythm of something ancient. Each seed was a kind of prayer, not for forgiveness, but for growth. Growth of roots, of peace, of something that could outlive the bitterness we'd both carried. I didn't know what the harvest would bring, but I knew the act of planting was enough for now. That evening, I found an envelope slipped beneath the front door. No name, no return, just my first name written in a hand I hadn't seen in years. I opened it slowly, the paper crackling like old fire. It was from my brother. A short letter, just a few lines. He didn't apologize, not directly, but he wrote, "I shouldn't have taken everything. I see that now. I don't know how to make it right, but I want to try." I sat there for a long time, letter in hand, not sure whether to laugh, cry, or just exhale. I folded it up carefully and placed it in the drawer beside Dad's pocket knife. Sometimes that's all we can ask of the people who've hurt us. Not perfection, just effort. A few days later, I saw his truck in the distance, parked near the far shed. He didn't come to the house, didn't knock on the door, but I noticed that the gutters had been cleaned. The back gate finally fixed. A fresh coat of paint had appeared on the barn's weathered boards. He was here in his own quiet way, doing what he could. And that, somehow, meant more than any grand gesture ever could. We were two old men now. Not boys fighting over toys, not heirs to a legacy we once misunderstood. Just men, doing the best we could with what remained. The townsfolk noticed the change too. They stopped whispering. They started waving more, lingering longer at the gate with warm bread or fresh eggs. Some even asked for advice, how to fix a fence, how to prune a pear tree. It wasn't about me, not really. It was about the land and the way it still breathed under our feet, about how sometimes returning home doesn't mean reclaiming what was lost, but tending to what's been waiting. I wasn't just rebuilding a farm. I was rebuilding a place in the world, and in that place there was room for healing, even between brothers who once stood on opposite sides of a will. That spring, the rains came earlier than usual. Gentle at first, a blessing to the crops, but then unrelenting, the kind of rain that soaks not just the fields but the soul. I'd sit by the window most evenings, sipping tea from the same chipped mug my mother used to favor, listening to the rhythm of water on the roof like an old lullaby. The fields swelled, the ditches overflowed, and even the barn creaked like it was remembering some sorrow of its own. And yet, I felt no panic, not anymore. That land had survived storms greater than this. And so had I. One particularly stormy morning, I found myself out by the shed again, boots sinking into mud, coat heavy with water. I was fixing the latch when I heard footsteps behind me, slow, hesitant, but familiar. My brother stood there, drenched, holding a jar of nails and a hammer in his trembling hand. He didn't say anything, just knelt beside me and got to work. For an hour we worked in silence, patching old boards, reinforcing hinges. It was the first time in decades that we'd built something side by side. And as ridiculous as it may sound, it felt like rebuilding more than a shed. It felt like restoring a bridge between us that we'd burned long ago. When we finished, he sat down on a tree stump and looked out toward the field. "Dad always wanted to plant pecans out there," he said, pointing to the ridge beyond the fence. I nodded. He said they'd outlive us both. In Dakis, we sat there for a while talking, really talking shit about everything and nothing. About the mule we once rode, the whippoorwill calls at night, the way Mom used to sing off-key when she cooked. It didn't erase the past, it didn't excuse the choices he made, but it softened the space between us. And sometimes that's where healing begins. Not in grand apologies, but in the quiet return to shared memories. A week later, we planted pecans on that ridge. Just the two of us, slow and steady, placing each sapling like a promise. The townspeople came by to watch, some even joining in. Children ran between the rows, laughing in the spring air, while old men offered tips we hadn't asked for. There was something sacred about that day, not in a religious sense, but in a human one. A moment where legacy shifted, no longer a source of pain and bitterness, but of community, growth, and reconciliation. We weren't just planting trees. We were rooting forgiveness into the soil. That night, after everyone left, I stood alone beneath the stars, hands dirty, back aching, but heart strangely light. I looked toward the house, its windows glowing warm in the darkness, and thought of all that had been taken, all that had been lost, and all that had been reclaimed. Not just land or title, but peace, dignity, connection. And as a soft wind passed through the branches of those young pecans, I knew that the story of my family wasn't over. It had merely found its true beginning. The next few weeks passed with the quiet intensity of healing. Not loud, not dramatic, but steady, like the way moss grows on old stone. I found myself digging through boxes in the attic one afternoon, searching for a set of fencing tools, when I came across a weathered envelope tucked between two photo albums. My name was written on it in my father's careful, blocky handwriting. My breath caught in my throat. I sat down on the attic floor, dust swirling in the shafts of sunlight, and opened it with trembling fingers. Inside was a letter, dated 3 days before he passed. It wasn't long, but it cut deeper than anything my brother had ever said. In it, my father spoke of regret, of how he wished he'd done more to protect me, to make sure everything was divided fairly. He wrote that he trusted I would do the right thing, that I had a heart strong enough to forgive, but wise enough not to be fooled. Tears fell onto the paper, blurring the ink. All these years, I had thought he'd stayed silent, but he had spoken, just too late for it to matter then, yet now it meant everything. I showed the letter to my brother. We sat at the kitchen table, the letter between us like some sacred relic. He read it in silence, jaw clenched, eyes misting over. When he finished, he simply said, "I should have known better." I didn't argue, I didn't try to soften it. Sometimes acknowledgement is more powerful than apology, and in that moment, I saw a man finally owning the weight of his choices, not deflecting, not excusing, just sitting with the truth that in itself was a kind of redemption. From that day on, something shifted between us. Not a return to childhood closeness, too much had happened for that, but something new and quieter, mutual respect. We worked together on the land, shoulder to shoulder, fixing fences, tilling soil, even mending the barn roof. The town began to notice. The same folks who once gossiped at the diner now nodded in approval when they saw us together. A few even said it reminded them of the old days when our father was alive. It felt like we were finally living up to the legacy that had been left to us, not just the property, but the values buried beneath it. One evening, as the sun dipped low behind the fields, I watched my brother walk out to the ridge where the pecans had been planted. He stood there, still as a statue, hands in his pockets. Then slowly, he knelt and pressed his palm to the earth. I didn't interrupt. I just watched, letting him have that moment alone. Maybe he was asking for forgiveness, from our father, from the land, from himself. Maybe he was simply trying to remember who he'd been before greed took root. Whatever it was, it felt like closure. And for the first time in decades, I felt no bitterness, only peace. Autumn arrived like a long exhale after a breath held too long. The leaves turned amber and gold, painting the horizon in fire, and the air smelled of soil, wood smoke, and something softer, a kind of contentment I hadn't known in years. The farm, once quiet and forgotten, was full of life again. The workers we'd invited back were tending the crops with care, laughter echoing across the fields. Even the horses seemed livelier, their hooves striking the ground with renewed energy. And at the center of it all was my brother. Different, quieter, but finally present. We began preparing for the town's annual harvest fair. For decades, our family had hosted a booth, selling pecans, jams, and handmade crafts, a tradition our parents loved. After the inheritance debacle, we'd stopped, but this year, it felt right to return. We set up a modest stall beneath the big oak tree at the square's edge, adorned with our mother's old checkered tablecloth and baskets of fresh goods. People came, cautiously at first, then with warmth. They asked questions, bought preserves, and stayed to talk. It felt like we were earning our place again, not by force, not by name, but by presence. I watched as my brother greeted neighbors, his smile hesitant but genuine. One elderly man, who had known our father since childhood, placed a hand on his shoulder and said, "Good to see you back where you belong." My brother looked stunned, as if unsure he deserved it. But he nodded, and for the first time I saw pride in his face, not arrogance, but the kind built from repair, not conquest. That moment alone was worth more than any piece of land or inheritance could offer. It was proof that broken things could be mended, slowly and honestly. That night we sat on the porch with mugs of cider, the fair lights still twinkling in the distance. He turned to me and said, "I know I can't fix everything, but I want to spend whatever time I have left trying." I nodded. There were no grand declarations, no dramatic forgiveness, just two old men side by side, letting the past settle like dust at our feet. I realized then that revenge had never been my goal. I hadn't taken anything from him. I had only reclaimed what was always meant to be shared, legacy, memory, and the love our parents tried so hard to instill. As the stars brightened above the fields, I thought about how much we'd both lost over the years. Time, trust, family moments we could never get back. But I also saw what we'd gained: clarity, humility, and maybe even grace. The farm had once been a battleground. Now it was a sanctuary. The soil didn't care about betrayal or bitterness. It welcomed whatever hands were willing to nurture it. And in tending to that soil together, we had finally begun tending to each other. The harvest was no longer about crops. It was about healing. The first frost came early that year, dusting the fields with silver and drawing soft steam from the horses' breaths in the morning light. I was rummaging through the attic of the old house, not searching for anything in particular, just letting memory guide my hands. Dust clung to every box and beam, but sunlight filtered through the slats in golden ribbons, revealing the forgotten corners of our family's life. I lifted an old cedar chest, one my mother used to store keepsakes in, and inside, wrapped in yellowed linen, I found the letter. It was addressed to both of us, me and my brother, in our father's handwriting, shaky but unmistakable. The ink had faded, but the words remained strong. It was dated just weeks before his passing. In it, he spoke not of land or money, but of values. He wrote about the weight of legacy, the importance of family, and the burden of unresolved resentment. "Whatever you inherit," he had written, "will mean nothing if it turns you into strangers." He asked us to forgive each other, to protect each other, and to remember that no piece of earth is worth more than a brother. I stood there for a long time, the letter trembling in my hand. When I brought it downstairs, my brother was sitting by the fireplace, his reading glasses low on his nose, flipping through an old ledger. I handed him the envelope without a word. He opened it, and as his eyes moved over the page, I saw them begin to glisten. He didn't speak at first, just folded the letter and pressed it to his chest like it was something sacred. Then he said softly, "I think Dad always knew we'd lose our way." That night, we framed the letter and hung it in the hallway by the front door, between two old family photographs. One was of our parents on their wedding day, and the other of us as boys, barefoot and grinning, standing in this very field with dirt on our cheeks and mischief in our eyes. It felt right, as if after all this time, the house was breathing easier. We didn't need to talk about forgiveness anymore. It was woven into the fabric of every gesture, every shared task, every quiet moment. As the fire crackled behind us and the wind pressed gently against the windows, I thought about all the things that could have broken us forever. Pride, greed, silence. But we were still here. Older, maybe a bit bent by time and regret, but unbroken. And in the warmth of that living room, under the soft glow of the lamp and the watchful eyes of our parents in their photographs, I realized something simple and profound. Sometimes, the greatest inheritance isn't land or wealth, but the chance to choose love again and again until it takes root. It was a crisp Saturday morning when the town gathered at the old community hall, a place that had once hosted our school recitals, harvest festivals and funerals. That day, though, it was transformed. Banners were strung from beam to beam, old photographs lined the walls, and the smell of cinnamon rolls and black coffee lingered in the air. It was a memorial of sorts, but not for a person, for a legacy. My father's name had quietly returned to people's lips, not because of the land he left behind, but because of the letter we had found. News travels fast in small places, especially when it's about redemption. My brother was the one who asked for the gathering. He had written a public letter of his own, published in the town paper, where he told the truth. He admitted to changing the documents, to taking more than he was entitled to, and to letting bitterness guide him instead of love. Most people already suspected, but hearing him confess was something else. There was silence in the room when he stood before everyone, older, humbled, his voice unsteady as he spoke not just to strangers, but to friends he'd avoided for years. When he finished, no one applauded. No one needed to. There was something deeper than applause that hung in the air, something closer to understanding. When it was my turn to speak, I didn't prepare a speech. I just looked around at the faces, many of them I had grown up with, and said, sometimes the right thing to do is the hard thing to do. But doing it late is better than never doing it at all. I told them about the letter from our father, about the man he had been, stern, proud, but full of integrity, and I told them that we were trying to live in a way that would make him proud. I didn't mention the fights, or the court records, or the bitterness. Everyone already knew. What mattered now was what we were building from the ashes. After the speeches, people came up quietly, some with hugs, some with tears. An older woman told me she remembered watching my father teach my brother how to plow straight rows in the field. A younger man said he once worked for my family during the summer and that those weeks had kept him out of trouble. Even the mayor came, bringing a small plaque engraved with our family name, offering to hang it near the old town well, so people remember what integrity looks like. My brother wept when he read the inscription. I placed my hand on his back and let him feel, without words, that I was still his brother. That evening, the two of us walked the field behind the house. The land had already started to bloom again, as if it too had been waiting for peace. We didn't talk much, just walked side by side, our boots crunching over the soft earth. The sky above was streaked with lavender and gold, and in that quiet moment, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Peace. Not just in my home, but in my heart. For the first time since our parents passed, I didn't feel like I was holding their legacy alone. We were carrying it together now. Bruised, maybe, but stronger than before. The seasons passed gently after that day, like pages turning in a book, finally back in the right hands. My brother and I didn't become best friends overnight. Years of silence and resentment don't dissolve that easily. But we began showing up. For birthdays, Sunday dinners, and slow afternoons fixing fences together. He offered to split the earnings from the farm, but I declined. What I wanted, what I had always wanted, wasn't money. It was to feel like we both stood under the same sky our parents once looked up at, equally, honestly. And now, we did. One morning, I walked out to the orchard behind the house. It had always been my mother's pride, though half the trees had withered after her passing. I stood there for a long time, fingers brushing the bark of an old pear tree, remembering her voice humming as she picked the fruit. I brought out some saplings I'd been nursing in pots, new trees for the old orchard. My grandson, barely 10, helped me dig the holes. Dirt under his nails, laughter on his lips. He didn't know he was planting more than trees. He was replanting something far older, family. Sometimes I see my brother sitting on the porch at dusk, a cup of coffee in his hand, watching the horizon. He still carries the weight of his choices, but I also see him lift his eyes with something like peace. I once believed he had taken everything our parents left me, the land, the heirlooms, even the memories. But I was wrong. He couldn't take the things that truly mattered, the stories, the values, the love we'd been raised in. And in reclaiming those, I gained something far greater than I ever expected. The townsfolk still tell the story, not as gossip, but as a lesson. Two brothers who lost their way, they say, and found it again where their roots were deepest. Some days, someone I don't know comes to shake my hand. They say thank you, not because of what we lost, but because of how we chose to heal. I never expected to become a symbol of anything. But if my story reminds even one person that it's never too late to do what's right, then it was worth everything. And so the farm lives on. The orchard grows, the fields turn golden each year, and the porch light still glows warmly each night. It's not just land anymore. It's a reminder that even after betrayal, pain, and silence, there is still room for forgiveness, still room for rebuilding. And in the end, what our parents truly left us wasn't in the deeds or the will. It was in how we learned to love, lose, and finally return to one another.